Welcome to Fashion And with me, Scott Schiavone, Fashion Curator. Just a reminder that you can keep up to date with everything Fashion And by following at Fashion And with Scott Schiavone on Instagram and by hitting that subscribe button. In this first episode of Season 5 of Fashion And, we'll be revisiting a designer who ruled the 1970s and propelled American fashion onto an international stage. However, this time we'll be getting the story from an insider and from someone who is a true fashion legend. This is Fashion and Holston, Chris Royer, model and muse. Roy Halston Frowick defined iconic American style and was hailed as the premier fashion designer in America. Chris Royer, Halston's fit model and muse from 1972, experienced firsthand the evolution of one of America's first fashion superstars. Chris, or Chrissy as Halston affectionately called her, was not only part of Halston's creative inner circle, but she was also a dear friend and muse. Chris, with the help of Halston himself, also created a comprehensive archive of some of the designer's most influential designs. This episode we have the pleasure and privilege of having Chris Royer with us for a very special interview where we'll be discussing Chris's personal Halston archive, focusing on Halston as a pure American original and a designer who constantly evolved his signature styles for the comfort and elegance of the ever-changing modern American woman. With the help of Chris, we'll be examining the design processes of Halston through 5 themes: the bias cut, must-have cashmere, beading and applique, construction and technique, and ultra suede. So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome a very, very special guest to Fashion And, Chris Royer, who was one of Halston's fit models and muses from 1972. Chris has graciously accepted to do an interview for all you Fashion And subscribers. So I would like to introduce Chris Royer. Hello, Chris. How are you doing?
Okay. Good to see you, Scott.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see you too. And thank you so much for taking time out to speak to us.
Well, I'm very excited about this. This should be really fantastic because it's important to people to know more about Halston as much as possible.
It is indeed. It is indeed. But before we jump into getting to know more about Halston, Chris, let's get to know a little bit more about you. So tell me, why did you get into fashion?
Well, I basically was obsessed with fashion even when I was little. My grandmother was very stylish and so was my mother, and we read Vogue and all the magazines and Mademoiselle, so I was firmly implanted when I got into my youth about fashion. I basically just was obsessed with it all the time.
As was I when I was growing up. I absolutely loved fashion. So tell me, how did you end up in New York then?
I was brought up and I lived in Brooklyn, which is a borough, New York City, and it was about 45-minute train ride into the city. So you could easily go in and out of the city quite a bit, and you had access to wonderful museums and exhibitions, concerts, and, all types of things that the city has to offer. Was very exciting, but it was very convenient to go in there. So I was very much influenced by the city and then seeing everybody dressed and styled in that ways.
Excellent. So in terms of fashion, who were your fashion icons of the time?
Okay. Well, the first one was Halston, obviously, because he was my mentor. I think Elsa Peretti was amazing. She was truly a mentor to me, being that she was not only a model and a very established model in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, but she also evolved her career into one of the great iconic jewelry designers of this period. And then I think Mr. Joe Eula, the great illustrator who basically reigned in illustration power during the 50s and 60s as well, and then the 70s when creative director for Halston.
Getting onto the subject of Holston, would you like to tell our subscribers how you first met Holston and what were your first impressions of him?
Sure. Well, during that time, while I was still in school, I was discovered by a magazine called Mademoiselle magazine, which was part of the Condé Nast grouping, which also owned Vogue. And it was equivalent to Elle magazine for young, chic women that love to style themselves in their own way. And they were doing a layout, a fashion layout called She's Got Style. And I was previewed in the editorials on my sense of style, my pictures, and how I would dress. What's funny is the editor of that particular layout was Deb D'Urberville. She's truly a great American, but she also was the house model for Claire McCardell.
Oh, wow.
And then she evolved into Harper's Bazaar, Mademoiselle magazine, and then she evolved into her photographing for Vogue and Italian Vogue and numerous other, ad campaigns. So she was quite amazing. During that time period, you did not know really what the designer looked like. There were no publicity shots of what the designer's face. It was always the name of the company and the actual designs of the clothes with the models in it. What happened was that I was with Wilhelmina Agency, which was one of the boutique premier agencies in New York at that point. And Willie was a very, very famous, iconic model. And so she created her own agency of boutique girls that had a distinctive style. And she mentored them. After doing Mademoiselle, they introduced me to Willie, and I signed up with Willie. And I was actually going to London for a short trip. And I did a couple model jobs there with Models One, which was an associate agency. And then when I came back, Wilhelmina called me and said, I've got the perfect match. Because I had spoken to Willie about my design and wanting to be involved in design as well as modeling. She was very, very close friends with Halston and they knew each other for years. And a lot of the models that Halston used were Wilhelmina models. So she called me and she said, go up, meet Halston and the design staff, and let's see how it goes. But he's very interested in finding a model and then also a muse who understands design. So I proceeded to go up to 68th Street and Madison Avenue, which is his first boutique called Halston Limited. And I was directed to go up in the elevator and go up to the third floor. Now the doors opened actually into the room. And in the room, it was beautiful. It was cream-colored walls, and the walls were just glorious in color because the sun was coming in. Floors were done in a bleached wood, so it looked like marble, and all the furniture was done in like a creamy, it looked like suede, and you had these beautiful ficus trees, and you had this amazing, sexy, sensual Brazilian music, and you had these what were called Rigo candles called cypress green, which was a very distinctive, clean, fresh fragrance, but also very exotic. I proceed to come in and I see this really handsome guy on the sofa in a black turtleneck and black pants. And I said, hi, I'm Chris Royer. And he goes, we know. And I'm like going, okay, we do. All right. So he says, yes, please sit down. You know, Willie's told me a lot of things and we're very interested in talking with you. Let's try fitting the clothes and then we can talk about your trip to London. and design and everything else. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. So we went through the clothes. All the clothes fit beautifully. And it was like we talked for, I would say, close to an hour, and talking about fashion and trips and visuals and everything else. And I reached a point where it was like, I guess I was waiting to see when I would meet Halston. So I'm like still waiting. And I said, well, I guess I got the job. He nodded his head. I said, can I ask you some questions? And he goes, yes. And I said, well, how old is Halston? And he looked at me, he goes, old enough. Well, do you think he has a sense of humor? And he says, yeah, I think, yes. And I said, suppose that, I'm interested in design. Do you think that, I could continue with the modeling, but then you can, bring me into the design staff and I can work with the rest of the design team, with Halston? And he said, yes, I think that's very doable. And I said, okay, so there's one more question. He goes, yes. And I said, well, since we get along together so well, do you think you can tell him that you and I could work together? And he goes, yes. And I'm like going, wow, this is fantastic, and he was so nice. And he had this little impish grin on his face. And it was like, I'm like delighted. And then all of a sudden, one of Halston's assistants comes in and says, Halston, Jackie Onassis is here for her fittings. So I'm like, what? And I thought, well, maybe he was hiding behind the screen, because, designers would hide behind the screen to look at the girls, but they didn't want to be seen. It was like, where'd he go? So I turned back to the sofa, and there he is, laughing hysterically. He rolled right down, and I'm like going, what? It was Halston. Oh my God, you're Halston. And he's like, yes. And I said, but you lied to me. He goes, no, I interviewed you and you have both jobs. And that's how we started.
That is such an amazing story. And it really shows sense of humor, Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Why don't you tell us about your background in design? So like what school did you go to and what was your aesthetic as a designer and how did that differ from Halston's?
Well, I went to Pratt Institute, which was a very famous design school for not only for fashion design, but also for architecture as well. And you were taught in a very disciplined way so that you really understood what draping, pattern making, and all the things that go into couture and made-to-order clothing, and also the aesthetics, the look and everything else. And they encouraged you to develop your own sense of style. For me, I was pretty much minimalistic. I was more of, I like casual with the chicness in there.
Yeah, so your aesthetics were really similar then.
Almost identical. As I understood the way the patterns and the way the fitting had to be done, he could only get from who was wearing it how it felt. And when he was designing, he was reaching a point, at that point, he needed to know as much as possible in knowing how the clothes would hang, drape, and fit. So when he was actually creating an outfit, he would know exactly how to position it.
So was Halston supportive of your, you said when you met you were talking about the kind of design aspects and would you be able to contribute to that? Was Halston supportive of that when you joined Halston and his team?
Very, very much so. Halston was a great mentor. A lot of the assistants, loved him because he really took time to teach them what you needed to know so that, obviously, as you evolve in your career, not all of them stayed with Halston. You had Naim Khan, who was mentored by Halston when he started in the beading. And he moved on to his own company. And you also had Ralph Rucci in there, who was in the workroom, who did a lot of the patterns, and he developed his own company after that. But he was a great mentor to all of them in that way, because he enjoyed doing that as well.
Yeah, it really fits with the type of man that you've described, this personality, that mentoring and really nurturing. That fits with that kind of character. So that's really nice to hear. So tell me, what was it like being a Halstonette?
Oh, being a Halstonette was fabulous. It was like, it was so, you were constantly busy. You were constantly having to prepare for, a fashion show or a press shooting or doing an editorial. A lot of the pieces that Halston would do, he would have what is called his own cabine of girls, which you would know. And then, depending upon the shooting, the schedules, we were used for advertising, and we knew exactly what he wanted. We knew how to turn, how to show the hand on the hip, how to make sure everything worked seamlessly in a photograph, because he wanted the photograph to be as perfect as possible. That requires practice and timing.
So tell me what a typical day was like at the Salon on 68th Street.
It was like we started 8 in the morning, and actually, Scott, during collection time, we could work from, let's say, 8 in the morning to, let's say, 2, 3 in the morning. You got up and it was sunlight. When you got home, you knew you had a couple of hours just to revive yourself and then go back to work. I will say that with the Versailles exhibition, the gala, we worked, oh my God, for weeks on the collection to perfect it. And it was easy. 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning to perfect it before we went over to Versailles.
And as a fit model, would you be standing that length of time whilst Holston was cutting and draping and pinning on you?
Yes, I was so engrossed with him cutting and what's called pinning and draping on me. I could stand very long hours, and be very absorbed into it, and I wasn't fatigued. Yeah.
As the process was happening, would you be kind of suggesting different things or talking about, like, this doesn't work, could, maybe if we change it this way?
Well, there was 2 ways of doing it. It's like, if it was uncomfortable, you had to have it sort of sit right. It wasn't fitting on your neck correctly. He would adjust it. It was the underarms and the sleeves and things. I would tell him that it's either riding too high or it's preventing me from moving in a certain way. And the same thing with pants. And so he needed feedback, but good feedback.
So then when you moved to Olympic Tower, how did studio life change?
Well, first of all, it was Halston Enterprises instead of Halston Limited. Halston Enterprises was slowly developing about 30 licensees in the U.S. alone. Halston was in constant meetings because he had to. He had to, like the others, with licensees, you have a design team on the licensee side who sit down and work with Halston and Halston's team to give the guidance, the look, the colors, the influence, and then they would come back and show Halston what they had done, and then he would approve or he would give them more guidance on it. Mm-hmm. So during the days, there was an awful lot of meetings back to back. So the actual creative time in there was really, pushed down, because it was very difficult. You could do like 1 or 2 fittings, but the creative brain was like thinking of things. You have to think of what you're doing. And then if you went into the mode of being creative, he needed the luxury of time to figure that out. So that was really reserved more towards the evening for the new looks and the new, and also weekends. It was constant, it was exciting work for me. I loved it, but it was like you were definitely dealing with, a very tight schedule to keep everything going for those collections, because the collections alone were 4 times a year, plus made to order, plus he was also in the Olympic Towers. his work staff alone in the workroom, he increased the staff to 40 so that he could accommodate not only Halston Originals, Halston Made to Order, and he could also accommodate Liza Minnelli's clothes, Liza Minnelli's theater clothes, Lauren Bacall's theater clothes, and Martha Graham. That's just, just part of it.
So talking about collections, Chris, you yourself have amassed quite a considerable Halston collection, and it's absolutely amazing, and it features a lot of key pieces that he designed. So it was Halston, wasn't it, who suggested that you start collecting his pieces, and did you and him collaborate in deciding which pieces were selected for your collection?
Yes, it actually started after Versailles, because it was traditional where the fitting models could choose one of the outfits from the collection to keep for herself, and he knew I liked, because Joe Eula would sketch me, so I was given certain Joe Eulas from the ones that were not used. So I was collecting Joe Eulas. So he knew I liked to collect, and he said, we had an issue with it, was called the Fairy Glass Princess dress. It unfortunately disappeared. It was a beautiful, beautiful piece. It was magnificent, and I don't know, somehow it disappeared. Now, also what was going on with all the designers during that time period, designers did not really think about collecting in general. They just thought they'd give it to their friends, or they would sell it for their famous sample sales to friends, editors, and everything else. So this was something where the dress disappeared, and he said, that's it. You and your mom are going to start your own collection. And I said, okay, because my mother used to wear Halston clothes as well. So that's how we basically started in collecting. And I worked with him on the specific pieces because there were certain pieces in there that reflected that influence and design point of view, which was very special to him. We specifically worked on, if I got something, he said, just take it, memo it out, but because we'll never get it back.
Almost like he was preserving his own legacy through you and through collecting and which pieces were going to be kept. So in your collection, which pieces were actually designed and fitted on you as a fit model?
The majority of them were. They were very specific, and some of them were more made to order. He created in 1979 and 80 what was called the Halston Sportswear collection. It was sportswear where you can combine things, because his Halston original line, it was an ensemble you bought. You couldn't buy, there weren't extra pants. If you bought, let's say, a suit, you'd have to go to his made to order, and they would have to see if they had the fabric to be able to make matching pants to the suit. So he created this beautiful line with his sportswear, and he put in some of his favorite iconic pieces, in the collection that could be, they worked wonderfully. You could create numerous looks. So he did a spring, summer, and he did a fall, winter. It was only for 1 year. That's why the sportswear sort of is so special, because it shows those iconic pieces, and you can see how he thought it out, how they could be mixed and matched.
And you've got a lot of those pieces in your collection.
I do.
Now we're going to talk about one of Halston's signature styles, and that is the bias cut. Halston took full advantage of the bias cut and its potential from early on in his career. By the time you joined Halston, Chris, in 1972, the bias cut was firmly part of Halston's kind of signature styles. How did Halston take the bias cut and develop it further to become one of his signatures?
Well, one of the great pieces, which became an iconic gown, was the sarong, which was the spiral cut bias.
Yeah.
And way that actually happened, we were actually on vacation in Fire Island, and I had gotten out of the pool, and he usually liked to sit on the lounge chair and sketch. And so when I pulled this, it was a big, bath towel, field press, and I was tying it. And where we were staying was the doors to the house were mirrored. And he said, all of a sudden, you could see the light bulb went off on his head. He said, no, come to because he always liked to work in mirrors. And so he pulled it from the back and twisted and turned it in the front. And it created like two sort of rabbit ears, two bunny ears. And we looked at it. And from that, big old towel, it became this beautiful dress. And we went, oh, silk chamoose. Well, that was one part of the story. The other part was telling the workroom what we were thinking, because they're going, what? So the story of the second part of the sarong dress is two parts. One, he created like a what is called a wired invisible bra underneath, and that we were using Abraham silk. It was a hammered satin, but it was only 36 inches wide. So to create the spiral in there, he had to create the seam. So that's how he, in the front, when you actually examine the sarong dress, the tie and everything, the pieces, there's numerous pieces in the tie, and it's all cut on the bias. So it gives that ability of a tremendous elegance and sensualness, and that the woman can wear it because it doesn't constrict her, it glides on her body. He was influenced by B&A and, a lot of other designers, but this was his way of developing the bias. And once he started developing that, then all of a sudden you can see in a lot of the other pieces from in the mid-70s on, a lot was experimented with bias cut.
With the bias cut was obviously, you've mentioned this, known for accentuating the body that was underneath the garment. So how important was the natural body for Halston, and how did it influence the design of a particular garment?
That's a great question. Halston was very, when he selected his models, he liked them tall. He chose models, other than one or two, that were at least 5'10". And the girls, he wanted to be able to switch the clothing for the shows on the girls. So he would pretty much know if one of the girls could not wear that outfit, he could switch it to the other girl, so that they all had similar, the body shape would adapt to it. And we all had what was called sort of like a figure 8, but our waists were very tiny. He realized on that it accentuated the hourglass figure, and then it also created a beautiful silhouette. And when you put the heels on, you actually look very long and languid and chic.
Yeah, when you look at those images of Halston runways, you always think like the models, including yourself, you're just so tall and slim and graceful, and that elongated line that just goes on and on and on for days. It's just absolutely stunning, and it's something that really sets Halston apart from his contemporaries in that time, is this gorgeous kind of line that the garment creates with the body. They kind of work in unison. So as a fit model in Muse, you obviously had first-hand experience of his design process. You talked how you would stand for hours while he would work with the fabric and the body to make the garment. So how did Halston cut, pin and arrange fabric onto the body?
It was a fascinating process because there were numerous ways he did it. When he would create jackets and coats, he would use a muslin, that had some body to it. Right. And he would shape it at first, do his sketches, and then the patterns would come in. And then he would rip it all apart and he would basically, especially with the armholes, he would pull it and create little darts and pin it, and then create more dots. And it almost was like sculpture. He really was like, clay is to a sculpture. That's what fabric was to him. So when he pulled and twisted the actual fabric and all these numerous pins on top of pins, it created the shape that he wanted. So they would take it off me, and then they would take it and steam it into that shape. Now that's for more structured clothes. Now for the others that he would pin, sometimes he would take very soft silk chamois and pin it on, let's say, a bodysuit or stocking, pin it here to the shoulders and let it hang. He also, on the bias cut, liked to hang the fabric on it so that it pulled out, so the bias cut was very loose. Then he would actually drape it. Now sometimes he could, after a certain point, he was cutting actually into the final fabric, but there were other times that he would try to use a lesser fabric just to experiment to see what would work the best. But the more he got familiar with it, he became an expert in cutting it. His eye was so exact that he knew exactly how to cut it and how it would hang on the body.
And in that process, there are hints of those designers, from like the 20s and the 30s that we talked about. You mentioned Vianney and Gray. It's that kind of process of allowing the fabric to do its work and sculpting the fabric, and like the fabric almost determines the style and shape of the dress, and the designer is almost like a conduit for the fabric as it forms to create a garment.
Halston was really the only one I know that actually did this process, because I think I think he formulated himself because he was fascinated with learning how to create these shapes, because to him it was a piece of artwork. It wasn't just a dress. These pieces were extremely special because to be able to do this type of technique and this construction to make it, look like this from just simple fabric, it requires a great deal of time, and it also, you got to think it out. That's why you need that time in there to experiment, and that was part of why he needed that time, his creative time, his creative zone.
What did it feel like to have the garment take shape like around your body?
It was thrilling. It was like, the assistants and we would have at least 2 assistants or more because he wanted them to watch. And they actually had, they had one tailor and one seamstress who would hand the pins and the scissors, because a lot of it was, his technique was very precise. He was almost like a surgeon, where it was like pins and then, scissor, and then he would go back because he's not going to hold them, so he would immediately go in and cut it. And, I know that I had many times in the actual pieces, at least 100 pins, on your actual garment. And it was like, I never thought, and what's funny is I don't like needles, but, to have all those pins in there, it was fascinating to see how he would pull and dart, move and twist, and then create this piece out of a simple flat piece of fabric. And it was very almost inspiring, but it was also very, it was very quiet. No one spoke. And it was like, everybody just got so engrossed in watching Halston's hands, handle this fabric and then create something magical out. It was just amazing.
So if we could go back to the sarong dress that you were part of the inspiration for, an amazing garment. In its history, it's been made from numerous fabrics and it's been worn by countless celebrities. What do you think, in your opinion, was the sarong dress's timeless appeal?
I think it goes back to what Halston would take simple concepts that were, you might say, everyday and make them iconic. So the bath towel where everyone would wrap themselves up, and then putting it into this incredible silk chamoose, and other silks and lamés and stuff. It was so beautiful, and it was very, very easy to wear. The way the women wore it, they felt beautiful. I think that was part of it.
And you talked about the sarong dress using the spiral cut on the bias. You've got a sarong dress, but you've also got an infinity shawl. So how did Holston kind of develop this spiral cut?
Well, the infinity shawl, what's interesting about the infinity shawl, he adapted it in different ways. He didn't just restrict it for my burgundy dress. The actual fabric had more body because it was silk file. So it gave a very full, controlled look if you want to wear it, on your shoulders. I have another one in a deep purple, which is the silk chamoose. And that looked so amazing, but it had no structure like the file, but it still gave that languid chicness that you could wear to the front or you could wear to the back. And some of the pictures will show you how flexible that piece could be. Once he changed the fabric, he had to redevelop it so that it really worked.
And in your collection, in the images of the pieces in your collection, you pair that deep purple infinity shawl with the black velvet,
yes,
bias cut dress. Cut. And I'm just fascinated in how, when you look at that dress, velvet is quite a heavy fabric, and the way that Halston cuts and constructs this dress, it just makes it look so fluid. Like, how did he achieve that using velvet?
Well, you see, he did numerous velvet fabrics. Some were silk, which gave a little more, it moved, and some of the others were to give it more body. It depended upon the fabrics. He also did one which is a top, which is spiral from both arms to the body. And then you have the actual pants, and they're all bias cut. So it spirals on the body as well as on the sleeves. But you can actually see how he starts with that spiral on the sleeve, and it just swirls around. When you put it on, you push the sleeves up, and the body just wraps around. It's incredible. The bias cut gave a lot of flexibility to women.
So we've talked a lot about, the bias cut and fabrics. Our last question in this section is how Halston treated his raw materials. I think we've already established that his raw materials were really important to his design process and to the finished product. But, as the years went on, did his relationship with fabrics change? And how did he allow the fabrics to influence his actual design processes?
Well, he loved luxury fabrics. So, when you're talking about his selection of fabric, he would obviously use cashmere and Yona cashmere, which is superb quality in his coats and things like that. His wools and everything he did with natural fiber were the best. But then he also loved, and he was fascinated with rayon, because he was one of the great designers that really promoted rayon in the 70s. And rayon had a funny sort of impression at that point, because rayon can be used in high price and low price. Now, rayon he developed for suits and day wear and pantsuits, because it didn't wrinkle, and it was just a fabulous fabric, and it could be perfectly tailored. And then he also used it. There's a famous ad of us where he did rayon caftans as well. Now, the second one is his beloved Ultra Suede. The Ultra Suede came in also in the early 70s. He was the first one to actually adopt Ultra Suede and integrate it in several categories that he, had, meaning where it was like coats, and then jackets, and he also developed into luggage, which was part of the Halston Hartman luggage. He loved it because Ultra Suede not only paired up with them, but they were a great team because they had this agreement that he could choose all the newest and latest colors of Ultra Suede. So there were fantastic colors there, and it looked like suede.
It seems like he was just such an innovator when it came to design and choosing fabrics that would suit his design and really pushing those fabrics to their limits, really.
Exactly. If he really liked the fabric, he made sure that he really understood all the properties that would work to his advantage for those particular designs.
Hey Chris, so let's talk about Halston's must-have cashmeres. How did Halston's cashmeres and knitwear differ from other designers?
Now, in the early 70s, Halston had certain designs done in Scotland where he created matching sweater dresses with long cardigans. Halston used a special cashmere company in Italy. The owner, Mr. Morelli, developed a unique process using lanolin to prevent pilling in Halston cashmeres. Now, in the late 70s and 80s, Halston created his cut and sew cashmere collection. Unlike the traditional woven sweater method, he would use bolts of cashmere to create new looks.
So we've talked about how Halston would drape and pin fabric to create fluid garments, but how did he create the same effect when designing his knitwear?
Now, Halston was inspired by the athletic and jogging outfits that Elsa Peretti and I wore when coming to work because they were simply comfortable. He would sketch out new looks for the workroom to create his own cashmere hoodies, zip jackets, pull-on jogging pants, tunics, wrap-tie coats, to name a few.
Now, the red cashmere goddess dress in your collection is a stunning example of how Halston appropriated knitwear. How did Halston develop the tie system that gave the dress its sporty but sexy look?
Now, Halston was influenced by an apron-style garment that Victor Hugo, the artist, had given to him. To create the Grecian look, Halston widened the volume of the dress and extended the tie so that it could wrap around the bodice, thus creating the goddess dress.
Now, it's been said that Halston's knitwear was inspired by the knitwear of American designer Man Böcker, especially his twin sets of the 1940s. How did Halston develop these ideas and translate them into his signature cashmere evening wear?
Halston loved cashmere and considered it a luxury fabric for evening wear. He also liked to use his iconic color palette like mint green, corals, peaches, blues, beige, creams and ivories and reds. He would make matching sweater sets to be worn with day dresses or long evening gowns. In addition, he would place the cardigan sweaters around the neck or around the hip of the model, thus creating his own signature sweater style. In the early 70s, he incorporated Elsa Peretti's silver jewelry, such as her necklaces, belts like the horseshoe belt, earrings, and iconic cuff bracelets with his cashmere collection, thus creating a chic and modern approach to sweater dressing.
Now Chris, I'm wondering if you could describe the concept of the AM/PM dress, and in reality, how does cashmere translate from day wear into evening wear?
The AM/PM look was developed by women because of their time schedule of not being able to come back home and dress for the evening. In a Halston cashmere day dress, they could easily change their Elsa Peretti silver jewelry to her diamonds by the yard and look perfectly chic for the evening.
Now, one of my all-time favourite pieces in your collection is the Cashmere Jumpsuit, and I find it just so glamorous and elegant. Did Halston design this garment to be a layering piece, or was it meant to be worn on its own?
Oh yes, Scott. Halston designed his jumpsuits to be multifunctional. He wanted them to be worn alone and also to be layered with numerous other pieces such as coats, scarves, jackets, and more.
Chris Royer, model and Muse, a huge thank you to you and your team. I'll see you next time, but before you go, don't forget to subscribe to Fashion And with me, Scott Schiavone, Fashion Curator.